The morning the truth finally pushed its way back into Willow Bend arrived without warning, carried on a pale, washed-out sky that made the cornfields look colorless and tired. A thin mist clung to the edges of Blackthorn Creek, drifting over the reeds like breath held too long. Deputy Eli Navarro stood at the water's edge, staring down at a small evidence pouch sealed hours earlier at the county lab. Inside lay a fragment of something that looked unremarkable to anyone who didn't know the weight it carried. A fleck of degraded material caught in the seams of a child's boot. Something almost invisible, but it was enough. Behind him, the hum of distant grain trucks rolled slowly across the farmland. The world looked unchanged, indifferent, exactly as it had been the morning Mara Ellison's boots were first found in this same patch of reeds. But for the first time in years, Eli felt the ground beneath him tilt, as if the story he'd carried for so long had been sitting on cracked foundations waiting to fall apart. He opened the pouch carefully, letting the light touch it. 7 years ago, this creek had been full from spring rains. Search teams had waded knee-deep through the cold currents. Volunteers had dragged nets across the slow black water. And by mid-morning, a fisherman had stepped out from the trees holding a pair of bright yellow rain boots, water dripping from their soles. People whispered then that the color was almost too cheerful to be real, as if the boots still remembered the child who wore them. Today, the memory of that moment still lingered like a bitter aftertaste in the town's throat. Eli lifted his eyes to the bank on the far side of the creek. The same weathered cottonwood tree leaned slightly over the water, its branches twisted like someone reaching for help too late. The grass around it shook softly in the breeze. It should have been an ordinary morning, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. Behind him, tires crunched on gravel. Sheriff Ray Buckley stepped out of his truck, closing the door with a slow exhale. He was older now, shoulders heavier, lines deeper around his eyes. "You got the call?" he asked. Eli nodded. "It's confirmed. The lab ran it 3 times, same match. Same profile." The sheriff didn't answer immediately. His gaze drifted toward the creek, then back to the evidence pouch. "You know what this means?" Eli did. The new DNA wasn't Daniel Ellison's. The man the town had condemned, the man still sitting in a cell hours away, had nothing to do with the biological material recovered. Instead, the match belonged to someone the town had barely noticed, someone who'd passed through Cedar Run County long enough to pour concrete on a state bridge project and disappear before the corn turned gold. For 7 years, everyone in Willow Bend had been certain of the story. They didn't say it out loud, but they believed it. Monsters don't come from outside. They grow in familiar places, behind familiar faces. Daniel Ellison had been quiet, reserved, slow to speak. Enough for some, too much for others. And in a town this small, certainty spreads faster than evidence ever does. Eli felt the sheriff studying him. "You were here that summer," Buckley said. "I remember," Eli replied. "I remember how quickly we made up our minds." Buckley's jaw tightened with something between regret and exhaustion. "We didn't make up our minds. The town did. We just kept up." But the words rang hollow. Both men knew better. A gust of wind swept across the creek, rattling the reeds where the boots had once lain. The memory of that day pressed itself into Eli's chest, the sheriff's radio crackling, townspeople gathering along the banks with hands over their mouths, Daniel Ellison dropping to his knees without a sound. And then the long blur of interviews, tests, accusations, all carried forward by momentum that no one dared question. Until today. Eli sealed the pouch and slipped it into the evidence case on the hood of the cruiser. "The state wants us in Des Moines by noon," he said. "They're ready to walk us through the reconstruction." Buckley let out a slow breath, the kind people release when the truth starts forcing them to look inward. "We'll have to notify the county attorney." And Lena. Just saying her name made the morning feel heavier. Lena Ellison had lived under a cloud for 7 years, caught between grief and the unbearable suspicion cast on her family. She had stopped coming to church, stopped lingering at the co-op, People spoke to her with gentle, clipped sentences, the kind reserved for someone marked by tragedy and doubt. No one had known how to comfort her. No one had dared to confront the possibility they were wrong. Eli closed the cruiser trunk, mind reeling. "This is going to tear something open here." "Maybe it needs to," Buckley replied. They stood together for a moment, facing the creek as if it held the answers they'd been missing. In a sense, it did. The truth had been waiting all along in the fibers of those boots, in the adhesive traces on the duct tape, in particles so small the county lab never had a chance of finding them in 2005. Science had outlasted doubt. It had outlasted judgment. It had outlasted the quiet betrayal of a town that convinced itself it already knew the truth. A flock of starlings lifted suddenly from the field across the water, turning in a dark wave that momentarily blotted out the pale sky. Eli watched them scatter, each bird pulled by instinct toward some distant destination. When they cleared, the landscape returned to its ordinary stillness. Buckley's radio crackled. A dispatcher's voice broke through with a calm announcement. The evidence warrant for the new suspect was approved. They would need to move quickly. Somewhere across state lines, a man who believed he had escaped his past was about to discover that time had caught up with him. Eli turned toward the truck. As he opened the door, he took one last look at the creek, at the reeds bending gently in the wind, at the place where the story had begun and where it now began again. To understand how this began, we go back to 2005. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe now. It helps us bring more truth to light. Most mornings in Willow Bend began the same way, with the faint rattle of wind against aluminum siding and the smell of ground coffee drifting from open kitchen windows. In the Ellison household, the quiet rhythm of early light belonged to Lena. She woke before the sun, padding softly across the linoleum floor while the old coffee maker sputtered to life. The house was always cool at that hour, filled with the blue-gray stillness of another Iowa morning. But Lena didn't mind. It was the time she treasured most, the brief hush before the world stirred and asked anything of her. Down the hallway, in a small bedroom with yellow curtains that caught the first hints of dawn, 4-year-old Mara Ellison slept curled around a stuffed rabbit, missing one ear. Her mother often joked that the toy looked worse each week, but Mara loved it fiercely, the way only small children can. When Lena pushed open the door, she would always pause a moment to take in the sight. Her daughter's soft breaths, the tangle of auburn hair across the pillow, the half-kicked blanket lying crumpled at the foot of the bed. Mara woke slowly, always with the same sleepy smile, as if the world needed time to come into focus. She preferred mornings when she could linger next to the window and watch the cattle truck rumble past the corner. But more than anything, she loved pulling on her yellow rain boots. It didn't matter whether the day was dry or raining. The boots were her prized possession. She wore them to the backyard, to the co-op when her father ran errands, to the garage when he tinkered with old trucks. To her, the boots were not shoes, they were a kind of armor, a bright splash of certainty in a world still too big to understand. Daniel Ellison used to laugh when she announced she couldn't go anywhere without them. "They're not magic," he would say, handing her a small bowl of cereal as she clumped across the kitchen. But the truth was, he admired the way she embraced them with such determination. In his quiet way, he envied her ability to claim something as simple as a pair of boots and make it her signature. He didn't have many things that felt like his. The Ellisons lived in a one-story house on Maple Lane, nearly hidden behind a row of cottonwoods. The place was worn around the edges, peeling paint on the front porch, a loose gutter that Daniel kept meaning to repair. But it felt lived in, warm, undeniably theirs. Weekends were often spent in the garage, where Daniel repaired farm vehicles for neighbors, willing to pay him cash or repay him with meals. Lena worked part-time at the co-op, spending the rest of her days trying to carve a little joy into Mara's world. Small-town life didn't offer much, but it offered enough for a child who found magic in puddles and dandelions. When they walked through Willow Bend, the community greeted them with the easy familiarity that defined rural towns. People knew the Ellisons as a quiet, hardworking family. At the co-op, customers sometimes bent down to compliment Mara's boots while she held tightly to her mother's hand. In those moments, Lena felt a soft pride, seeing her daughter beam at the smallest kindness. Children absorb affection like sunlight, she often thought. They bloom in it. On warm afternoons, Mara played in the backyard while Lena hung laundry on the line. The air smelled of fresh soil and sweet grain dust from the fields. Mara's laughter carried across the yard in little bursts as she hopped from stepping stone to stepping stone, pretending she was crossing a river no one else could see. Her rain boots thumped lightly against the ground, leaving faint marks in the dirt that disappeared by evening. Daniel returned home at sundown most days, his shirt smelling of motor oil and sweat. He would scoop Mara into his arms, pretending she weighed more than he could manage, making her giggle until she hiccuped. Some evenings, when the light softened and the day loosened its grip, the three of them would sit on the back steps and watch the fireflies drift like embers over the yard. Those moments were small, almost unremarkable, but they formed the texture of their lives. Nothing extraordinary, nothing dramatic. Just a family caught in the simple gravity of loving one another. The yellow rain boots were always beside the back door. Even after long days, Mara asked to wash them with a small sponge so they would be ready for tomorrow's adventures. She insisted they needed to stay bright, something Daniel and Lena didn't correct. They liked the idea that brightness could be preserved, that childhood didn't have to blur or fade. People in Willow Bend remember seeing Mara often. At the 4th of July parade, sitting on Daniel's shoulders waving a paper flag. At church during Easter, pressing her boots together under the pew so the heels made little clacks. At the fall bazaar where she picked a caramel apple and smeared her face with sticky fingerprints. She wasn't the loudest child or the boldest, but she carried a kind of gentle gravity that made others soften when they spoke to her. Spring 2005 began with unpredictable weather. Some days felt like winter refusing to leave. Others felt like summer rushing in too fast. On the first warm morning of June, Mara woke earlier than usual. She padded down the hallway quietly and found her mother already in the kitchen, folding dish towels into neat stacks. Lena smiled and lifted her into a warm hug, inhaling the familiar scent of her daughter's hair shampoo, sweat, and sunshine, all tangled together. That day was not meant to be special. Lena had a mid-morning shift at the co-op. Daniel planned to finish repairing a grain truck. Mara would spend the morning in the yard, wandering between the garden beds and the little patch of shade beneath the cottonwoods. She played with her rabbit, followed ants across the patio stones, and used a broken laundry basket as a makeshift fort. It was an ordinary day made up of ordinary pieces. But throughout the morning, she returned again and again to her rain boots. She tugged them on and off, testing the buckles, lining them up perfectly before nudging them slightly out of place so she could do it again. Lena watched from the sink, amused, unaware of how deeply this image would later imprint itself on her memory. In the late afternoon, Mara sat beside her father on the steps of the garage, tracing shapes in the dust while Daniel wiped his hands on an oil-stained rag. She leaned her head against his arm, a habit she had developed since learning to walk. To her, it was the safest place in the world. Daniel didn't speak much, but he liked listening to her describe her tiny discoveries. The 2 ladybugs she'd found on a leaf, the bird that dropped a feather in the yard, the new puddle she hoped the rain would make tomorrow. Before bedtime, Lena walked into Mara's room carrying clean pajamas. She paused in the doorway, watching her daughter hop around on the carpet, boots still on her feet. "Last dance before lights out?" Lena teased. Mara nodded vigorously, spinning until she lost her balance and tumbled into her mother's arms, giggling uncontrollably. Lena lifted her onto the bed, unbuckling the boots gently so they wouldn't pinch her daughter's legs. She placed them beside the curtains, where they caught the last orange streaks of sunset. Daniel came in a moment later, kissed Mara on the forehead, and turned on the small night lamp shaped like a sunflower. She clutched her one-eared rabbit close, eyes fluttering with the weight of sleep. The boots remained by the window, almost glowing in the warm light. Nothing in the room suggested the next morning would unravel everything they knew. Nothing hinted at how quickly certainty can crumble, how a community can turn on itself, how a single pair of boots could become a symbol of truth buried beneath years of doubt. That night, the world felt safe. And for the last time, Mara drifted into sleep believing tomorrow would come just like every day before it. The last morning of Mara Ellison's life began before the sky had fully decided to turn blue. The air held a coolness that hovered between spring and summer, the kind that made the screen door creak softly whenever the breeze shifted. In Willow Bend, dawn usually arrived gently, seeping into the cottonwoods like spilled milk. But that morning carried a sharper stillness quiet enough that even the cattle in the neighboring pasture remained motionless. According to the later reconstruction, the timeline began around 5:42 a.m. Melina, exhausted from an early shift the previous day, had fallen back asleep after using the bathroom. She would tell investigators she remembered hearing the refrigerator hum and nothing else. Daniel, who had worked late repairing a transmission, was asleep so deeply that he didn't stir when the back latch clicked. Somewhere between 5:45 and 6:05, an intruder stepped behind the Ellison home. The dew was heavy on the grass. Footprints would later be impossible to distinguish from those of the family or neighborhood children. A small gap in the fence along the southern edge of the yard, usually ignored, created a narrow corridor leading toward the cottonwoods. The person moved with certainty, slipping past the rusted lawn chairs and toward the back door that didn't always close tightly unless given a firm push. What happened inside the house would never be fully known, but the details recovered later suggest a quick, opportunistic entry. The intruder avoided the kitchen, bypassed the creaking floorboard near the dining table, and stepped into the hallway where the morning light hadn't reached. Mara's door was open. She slept lightly, curled against her rabbit as she had every night since she was 2. The intruder lifted her, perhaps expecting her to cry out, but she didn't wake. Children often sleep through movement when carried. The sensation can feel like being rocked. The next verifiable timestamp came at 6:18 a.m. A neighbor across the street let her dog out and noticed a figure walking quickly along the ditch line toward the service road. She couldn't tell who it was, just the shape of an adult holding something against their chest. Moments later, she heard a truck engine turn over somewhere near the bridge construction area, but thought nothing of it. In Willow Bend, trucks starting early was part of the landscape, as normal as the cicadas at dusk. Meanwhile, inside the Ellison home, the house remained still. Lena awoke shortly after 7 o'clock, sunlight warming the foot of her bed. She folded back the blanket, walked quietly to the hallway, and paused when she noticed the back door was not fully shut. It hung open by a small crack, just wide enough to let in a thin line of bright morning. She closed it gently, assuming Daniel had stepped out earlier and forgotten to pull it tight. Only then did she go to wake her daughter. The sight of the empty bed did not register as danger at first. Mara sometimes wandered to the living room to sit by the window. But she wasn't there. And she wasn't in the bathroom or by the back steps where she liked to inspect ants along the concrete. When Lena called out her daughter's name, the house answered only with the faint groan of pipes warming. Panic arrived abruptly, like cold water poured over her shoulders. She searched the house twice, then a third time, opening closets, pulling back curtains, looking under the bed as if a child might suddenly appear there by miracle. By 7:19, she woke Daniel. His confusion turned quickly to fear, but he tried to stay composed, moving from room to room, checking the backyard, calling for Mara in a strained voice that carried across the grass. By 7:31, he called 911. The dispatcher's notes preserved the tremor in his voice. "My daughter, she's not here. The door was open. She's only 4. From that moment, every minute gained a kind of gravity that still feels heavy in the official timeline. At 7:44, 2 deputies arrived, followed by volunteer firefighters who helped coordinate an initial search of the property. The house was small enough to inspect in under 5 minutes. Deputies fanned out through the yard. One walked the fence line. Another checked the garage. By 8:15, more volunteers from the neighborhood appeared, still in their pajamas, offering to search the cottonwoods and the small drainage ditch behind the Ellison fence. The sun climbed higher, burning off the mist but revealing nothing. Search teams moved toward the creek, forming a wide line as they pushed through the tall grass. The reeds near the water were thick, swaying gently in the breeze, carrying the scent of mud and river algae. People called her name softly at first, then louder, their voices echoing over the creek's slow current. At 9:02 a.m., a fisherman named Joel Mercer spotted something bright near the water. He had been moving along the bank, casting into deeper pockets where catfish often hid, when he noticed a splash of yellow against the reeds. At first, he thought it was a piece of litter blown from a yard. But as he drew closer, the object resolved into something unmistakable: a child's rain boot. He reached down and lifted it by the heel. Water dripped from the top, forming concentric ripples that spread slowly across the creek's surface. A chill climbed his spine before he could make sense of it. Then, only a foot away from where he'd found the first boot, he saw the second one tipped sideways, half buried beneath the reeds. He didn't yell. He didn't move. For a long moment, he just stared, understanding in an instant what this meant. He raised the boot in the air until one of the volunteer searchers caught sight of it and sprinted toward him. The boots were placed carefully on a clean tarp, though the cold water had already washed away most superficial traces. Deputies cordoned off the area and ordered all volunteers to step back. The boots sat there in the sunlight, still bright, still unmistakably hers. In that moment, they became the most powerful objects in the investigation, symbols of innocence uprooted and lost. At 9:27, a deputy noticed drag marks in the wet grass near the riverbank. They were faint, half erased by the morning's breeze, but long enough to suggest something, or someone had been pulled. Further downstream, a scrap of fabric, pink and frayed, clung to a low-hanging branch. These clues deepened the urgency, drawing search teams along the water's edge in widening circles. At 10:12, the discovery was made. A volunteer fireman spotted something caught against a cluster of fallen branches where the creek narrowed. It was small, motionless, entangled in the eddies of the slow-moving water. Deputies waded in, lifting carefully, speaking gently to one another, as if the quiet itself mattered. By then, there was no ambiguity. The thing they carried back to shore ended the search and rewrote every life connected to it. Daniel fell to his knees when he saw the deputies returning up the embankment. People nearby recalled the sound he made, low and guttural, though he didn't cry. Lena collapsed into the arms of a neighbor, her body trembling uncontrollably. In Willow Bend, grief tends to move through people like a wave, silent at first, then unstoppable. By midday, half the town had gathered near the service road, offering murmured prayers, touching shoulders, whispering shock. But beneath it all, another current was beginning to stir, subtle but unmistakable. Questions, suspicions, assumptions. As investigators pushed deeper into the creekside area, they cataloged every possible clue. Scrapes on rocks, disturbed soil, impressions in the mud. A narrow pathway of flattened grass suggested someone had moved quickly along the bank. Near the cottonwood closest to the water, they found adhesive residue on a broken twig, something they would later compare to the duct tape recovered from the child's body. But one detail stood out. Along the edge of the service road, near the old bridge construction zone, the ground bore parallel tracks from heavy machinery. Unlike the impressions near the creek, these were sharp, recent, and inconsistent with the vehicles used by volunteers. The tracks led toward an equipment shed where contractors had stored their tools. No one paid the shed much attention in the first hours. It was assumed to be irrelevant, part of the background life of the town. Just another ordinary detail. but the door of the shed was slightly ajar. Inside, faint footprints marked the dust. One led directly toward the back window, barely large enough for a small person to slip through, but large enough for a grown man if he forced it. Investigators photographed the scene, but the prints were too smudged to identify. The shed was locked up, the equipment returned to its racks, and the possibility of a stranger passing through faded beneath the weight of the town's certainty. The crime scene offered many pieces, but none of them told a clear story yet. In the days ahead, those pieces would be sifted, reshaped, and forced into a narrative that fit the assumptions of a frightened community. The creek had revealed the child. The boots had offered a clue. But beneath the reeds and mud, something crucial still waited, something overlooked, something that would remain unresolved for years. The oddity lingered at the edge of the official report, a single partial footprint found not near the Ellison home. Not near the creek, but on the outside wall of the contractor's shed, half hidden in fine gray dust. It didn't match Daniel's boots or any volunteer's shoes. And despite its obvious peculiarity, no one could explain how it got there. It would take 7 years, and a technology not yet available in 2005, to understand why. The investigation that followed the discovery at Blackthorn Creek began with a sense of urgency so sharp it felt almost like hope. In the first week, deputies moved swiftly, tracking every neighbor, every passerby, every possible route through the cottonwoods and service road. There was a belief, unspoken, but deeply shared, that answers would come quickly, that a tragedy this small and this intimate must have a cause close at hand. But the first days of a case often shape the ones that follow, and in Willow Bend, the early assumptions grew roots before the evidence could contradict them. The town's focus narrowed almost immediately on Daniel Ellison. He was quiet, withdrawn, naturally uneasy under questioning. To some investigators, that discomfort carried a kind of weight. To others, it was simply a man drowning in grief. But grief is often misread when the community is afraid, and people in Willow Bend were very afraid. The sheriff's office split into 2 teams in those first weeks. One combed the creek, the contractor's shed, and the service road for any trace of a stranger. The other team, led by Detective Henley from Cedar Run County, began constructing a profile centered around the possibility that the father was involved. His reasoning, sketched in the corners of his notebook, hinged on a familiar rationale. Most harm to children comes from people they know. Daniel was interviewed multiple times. The transcripts reflect his fatigue, the way he repeated himself, the way he struggled to recall the smallest details. He couldn't remember if he had checked the back door the night before. He didn't know whether the latch had clicked shut. He couldn't say exactly what time he'd fallen asleep. For Henley, every uncertainty became a notch in the wrong direction. Neighbors, when approached for statements, offered recollections tinted by fear. One said Daniel had seemed off in the weeks before the incident. Another recalled hearing raised voices once, though she couldn't remember when. A few noted his quiet nature, interpreting it suddenly as secretive. Even observations rooted in kindness began to twist under the weight of suspicion. He never talked much, one man at the co-op told deputies. You never really knew what he was thinking. By the end of the first month, the investigation had drifted into a kind of controlled paralysis. Every lead pointing outside the family either evaporated or grew too faint to follow. The partial footprint found near the contractor's shed was dismissed as belonging to a worker from an earlier date. The adhesive residue near the cottonwood was analyzed but yielded nothing conclusive. The search for a possible drifter who passed through town in late May stalled when adjacent counties reported no matching descriptions. The possibility of a stranger narrowed until it barely remained at all. Meanwhile, the case file thickened with reports, transcripts, and timelines whose details overlapped without ever fully aligning. Different deputies noted different impressions in the mud near the creek, though none could be tied to a specific shoe size. A fisherman claimed he saw a truck leaving the service road early that morning, but he wasn't certain of the time. A teenage boy reported hearing a car door slam before dawn, but his account shifted slightly each time he repeated it. By midsummer, the county attorney's office began to press for closure. Mara's death had shaken the town, and public trust was fraying. People whispered in church pews. They murmured at the gas station. They studied Daniel's face at the grocery store, as if searching for something incriminating, hidden just beneath the skin. Lena felt the shift too. Friends who once hugged her now approached carefully, offering condolences but avoiding eye contact. Neighbors left casseroles on the porch without knocking. The silence grew heavier than words could have been. One afternoon, Lena walked into the sheriff's office unannounced. She asked to speak to Detective Henley. When he met her in the small interview room, she folded her hands tightly on the table and said, "You're looking in the wrong place." Henley sighed, the kind of weary sound made by someone who believes they've already examined every angle. "We're looking everywhere, ma'am." "You're not," she whispered. "My husband would never hurt her." The detective made notes he would later describe as considering all perspectives, though they added nothing to the direction the case was already moving. The community had formed its conclusion, and the investigation followed. By August, deputies prepared the primary case summary to forward to the county attorney. It highlighted gaps in Daniel's timeline, the open back door, and his reported exhaustion the night before. It cited the behavioral analysis Henley had drafted, noting Daniel's flat affect during key moments. It included testimonies from neighbors who admitted they suspected something was wrong in the Ellison household, even if they couldn't articulate why. None of those statements mentioned the partial footprint at the contractor's shed. None mentioned the equipment shed's unlocked window. None mentioned the unidentified tracks near the service road. Eli Navarro, still a young deputy at the time, noticed these omissions but said nothing. In his early career, he felt out of place challenging the established rhythm of an investigation, especially one led by a senior detective from the county. He reviewed the discarded leads again and again, uneasy but uncertain of what he was supposed to push back against. His reports remained factual, neutral, obedient to the chain of command. The sheriff's office presented their findings in September. The county attorney requested a follow-up interview with Daniel, which lasted nearly 2 hours. Later, the transcript showed Daniel's confusion deepening as the questions became more pointed. At one moment, when asked whether he had ever lost patience with Mara, he paused for too long, searching his memory. That pause became a bullet point in the prosecutor's margin. Lena attended every meeting she was allowed to. She sat quietly in the corner, gripping a tissue, barely speaking except to repeat the same words. "He didn't do this." Her voice often trembled. Her insistence, instead of being heard as devotion or clarity, was interpreted as denial. False suspects came and went without leading anywhere. A delivery driver who passed through the neighborhood that morning. A farmhand with a DUI record. 2 teenagers who had been out late drinking near the creek. Each was examined, questioned, cleared. The file records a total of 16 outside suspects evaluated. None yielded a solid lead. By October, the public pressure reached a breaking point. Local media, usually slow to touch the tragedies of small towns, began publishing headlines hinting at a hidden story inside the Ellison home. A reporter from Cedar Run Gazette stood outside the co-op and asked Lena, without empathy, "Do you feel unsafe at home?" The question spread quickly, twisting into speculation that followed her down every aisle of the store. Inside the sheriff's office, Detective Henley pressed for a case resolution. "If we don't move soon," he warned, "the window will close." Community trust erodes fast in cases like this, but the trust had already eroded, only not in the way he meant. In early November, the county attorney's office filed preliminary charges against Daniel Ellison. The community reacted with a kind of grim affirmation. Some felt relief, others discomfort, but few questioned the narrative forming around them. Grief, when it turns inward, becomes judgment. Judgment spreads quickly. During the trial preparations, investigators returned to the Ellison home multiple times, hoping to uncover something that reinforced their assumptions. But no new evidence surfaced. The case relied heavily on circumstantial indicators, Daniel's perceived emotional distance, and the notion that tragedies rarely stem from strangers in small towns. Lena pleaded with anyone who would listen. She visited the sheriff, the county attorney, even the pastor at the Lutheran church where she once felt safe. Her words, however heartfelt, fell into the widening gap between fear and certainty. By winter, the service road had frozen over. The reeds at Blackthorn Creek lay flattened under frost. Snow buried the last traces of the boot prints and drag marks, as if the earth itself wanted to forget. The contractor's shed was locked for the season, the tools removed, the equipment silent. The partial footprint, photographed once and archived without context, was tucked into a file and never mentioned again. Months later, after a strained plea agreement and overwhelming community pressure, Daniel accepted the outcome placed before him. He did not confess. He did not admit wrongdoing. He merely lacked the strength to continue fighting. When he was taken away, the air in Willow Bend grew still. Some felt vindicated. Others felt uneasy but didn't say so. Lena watched the squad car pull away from her home and felt the ground disappear beneath her. The sheriff's office closed the file shortly afterward, marking it solved in a tone that carried more exhaustion than triumph. Investigators returned to their routines. The community tried to settle back into its rhythms. But beneath the surface, a quiet discomfort remained, like a bruise that refused to fade. Eli, who had been reassigned to patrol duty, kept the case in the back of his mind. He reviewed the old notes in the quiet hours of night shifts, unsure what he hoped to find. Every time he closed the folder, he felt the same hollow sensation. Something in that case didn't fit. Something had been overlooked. Years would pass before he finally understood what it was. The years that followed moved in uneven waves, sometimes slow as winter mud, sometimes rushing past before anyone could name what had changed. For Lena Ellison, time became something she lived beside rather than inside. Days happened around her, not through her. The house on Maple Lane, once filled with the soft rhythms of a young child's world, turned hollow and too quiet. Mara's room stayed intact at first, as if waiting for a return no one dared to admit was impossible. Her drawings remained taped to the wall, faded by sunlight. The stuffed rabbit with the missing ear sat on the pillow, untouched for months. When Daniel was taken away, the house shifted again. His clothes disappeared from the closet. His tools were boxed. The garage where he once spent evenings repairing engines while Mara watched from the steps seemed frozen in mid-breath. The wrench he used most often still hung crooked on its peg. For a long time, Lena couldn't bring herself to straighten it. People in Willow Bend learned to talk around the Ellison tragedy rather than through it. They spoke in lowered tones at the diner, offered polite nods at the co-op, and avoided asking Lena how she was doing. Grief unsettles small towns. It forces people to see how fragile their own routines are. And when that grief becomes complicated by blame and suspicion, it grows sharper, more isolating. In the months after the case closed, Lena found small tasks to keep herself upright. She worked longer hours at the co-op, scanning groceries with automatic motions. She started baking again, even though she rarely ate what she made. She cleaned the house twice as often as before, not because it was dirty, but because stillness frightened her. Some evenings she walked along the edge of Blackthorn Creek, stopping near the reeds where the yellow boots had been found, trying to understand how life could pivot so violently at that exact spot. Occasionally she received letters from relatives in other counties who offered space to stay, a room to rest, a chance to leave Willow Bend behind. But leaving felt like erasing Mara, as if the child's laughter were stitched into the soil itself. So Lena stayed. She endured the sideways glances, the pity, the unspoken questions. She endured the way people said Daniel's name in hushed tones, as if even after the case was closed, the wound could reopen if handled too roughly. The days blended. Seasons shifted. The cottonwoods shed their leaves and grew them back again. And with each cycle, Lena aged in ways she didn't notice until she saw her reflection in the kitchen window and realized the woman staring back no longer looked like someone in her 20s. Her hair lost its brightness. Lines appeared around her mouth. Her posture softened, as though her body had begun to carry the weight of absence in its bones. During these years, the memories of Mara did not fade so much as settle, sinking deeper into the quiet spaces of the house. On the refrigerator, photos curled at the edges. In one of them, Mara sat on Daniel's shoulders during a parade, her boots dangling over his chest. The yellow color had dulled slightly, the sun taking its toll. Lena sometimes stood before that photo for long minutes, tracing the outline of her daughter's smile without touching the glass. As for Daniel, the lost years hardened him. Prison carved sharp angles into his face. His eyes dimmed in the first winter behind bars, not from guilt but from the realization that the world had accepted a story he knew was wrong. He rarely spoke during visitation hours. When Lena visited every few months, bringing small updates from Willow Bend, he listened in silence, nodding occasionally but offering little. She could tell he was disappearing inside himself, retreating from a world that no longer believed him. The guards noted his good behavior. They recorded him as quiet, compliant, polite. But beneath the observations lay a truth no one documented. He was grieving two losses at once, his daughter and his life. In town, the Ellison case slowly dissolved into background memory. A new principal was hired at the elementary school. The co-op expanded its aisles. The service road by the creek was repaved. People moved on, as people do, without meaning harm. For many, the tragedy became a story defined by its ending, not its beginning. But not for everyone. On the outskirts of Willow Bend, Eli Navarro carried the case with him. His career moved forward, traffic stops, domestic calls, patrol rotations, but the images from the creek still returned in quiet moments. He remembered the boots laid out on the tarp. He remembered the partial footprint near the contractor shed, the one that didn't match Daniel or any volunteer. He remembered the uneasy silence during meetings when Henley dismissed alternative theories. And he remembered the way Lena's voice trembled the day she begged them to reconsider. Sometimes Eli reopened the old case file late at night, flipping through the pages with a reluctant sense of responsibility. The inconsistencies bothered him. The weight of what had been overlooked pressed into his mind like a slowly tightening vice. But he was young then and unsure of how to challenge decisions that seemed final. He lacked the rank to push back, lacked the confidence to demand a deeper look. So the file stayed in the cabinet. And the years ticked by. 4 years after Mara's death, Willow Bend began to change in subtle ways. New families moved into old houses. The cottonwoods behind the Ellison home were trimmed back. A playground was built near the church, and children's laughter once again drifted across the neighborhood. But for Lena, each sound reminded her of an absence rather than a renewal. She avoided the playground. She chose different routes home. She couldn't bear the echoes. On the anniversary of Mara's death, Lena sat alone in her daughter's room. She placed the remaining yellow boot on her lap, brushing her fingers along the worn buckle. She wondered if Mara would have grown into a child who preferred sneakers or sandals. She wondered how tall she would have been, what her voice would have sounded like at 7 or 8. Remorse settled inside her like dust, a soft but persistent layer. At times she wrote letters addressed to Mara, though she never mailed them. She kept them in a box beside the bed. Some were short, a few sentences about weather or daily moments. Others were longer, filled with confessions she couldn't share with anyone else. She often ended them with the same line, "I hope you know we never stopped looking for you." Not really. Daniel received none of these letters. Lena didn't know how to tell him about her own struggles, and Daniel didn't ask. Their conversations grew sparse, delicate, held together by the last threads of shared memory. Eventually, even those threads frayed. He stopped requesting visits. She stopped forcing them. By the 7th year, Willow Bend had nearly erased the urgency surrounding the case. People discussed it only when prompted by outsiders or when a new family asked about local history. Most had grown comfortable with the idea that justice had been served. Only a handful, quiet, observant, burdened, felt the lingering discomfort of something unresolved. In early spring of that year, a letter arrived at the sheriff's office. It came from the state's Cold Case Initiative, announcing new partnerships with counties to reevaluate archived evidence. The letter described advances in trace forensic technology methods that could isolate microscopic cells from fabrics, even those submerged in water. Eli found the letter pinned to a bulletin board outside the administrative office. He read it twice, then 3 times. Something tightened inside him, a feeling he had not allowed himself to fully acknowledge in years. He thought of the boots. He thought of the duct tape. He thought of the partial footprint that had been dismissed. And he thought of the quiet weight the town had placed on one man without ever proving a thing. He removed the letter from the board and folded it into his jacket pocket. Later that evening, as rain fell softly across the fields, Eli sat alone in his patrol car, the engine off, listening to the steady rhythm of drops tapping against the roof. He opened the old case file once more. The pages looked weathered now, their edges curled from use. But the details still spoke, faintly, waiting for someone to listen. When he closed the file, he knew what he needed to do. Not because he expected to fix what had already been broken, but because he could no longer carry the weight of inaction. The small hope began there, in a patrol car, in the quiet of a rainy evening, in the hands of someone finally willing to reopen a door others had sealed shut. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop an emoji in the comments. The letter from the state's Cold Case Initiative sat on Eli Navarro's desk for 2 days before he found the nerve to act on it. He read it each morning, letting the words sink into him slowly. New technology, expanded trace recovery, partnership for retesting archived evidence. The language was clinical, almost cold, but something beneath it stirred with quiet promise. It suggested that time was no longer a wall, but a door, one that might finally open. On the 3rd morning, he pulled the old Ellison casebox from the shelf where it had sat untouched for years. Dust lifted into the light in soft spirals as he set it on the table. The cardboard felt weaker now, as if the weight of the past had softened it. He opened it carefully, revealing the artifacts of a story that still clung to the town like a bruise. The yellow rain boots lay wrapped in sealed plastic, faint marks of creek mud still visible along the solace. The duct tape samples, preserved between waxed sheets, had grown brittle around the edges. The clothing, folded tightly, carried the ghost of water damage. Each item, once exhausted during the early investigation, now looked different, less like dead ends and more like suspended truths waiting to be recognized. Eli filled out the chain of custody forms with steady hands. When he signed the final line, he felt something shift in him, a quiet determination replacing the helplessness of years past. The evidence left Willow Bend in a state van before noon, heading toward the Iowa State Forensic Laboratory in Des Moines. The lab's white corridors were a world away from the sheriff's office. Every surface gleamed with sterilized brightness. Machines hummed in quiet concentration. Technicians in pale gloves moved deliberately, as if handling the future itself. 2 specialists, Dr. Helena Marston and her technician, Luis Calder, received the evidence with the practiced focus of people who lived at the crossroads of patience and precision. Dr. Marston studied the boots first. She turned them gently under the hood light, taking in every crease, every scuff that time had not erased. Waterlogged boots are unpredictable, she said softly, more to herself than to anyone else. But trace technology has gotten better. We'll start with microvacuuming. Luis prepared the microvacuum, a device designed to collect microscopic particles from fabric seams. What once required visible biological matter could now be achieved with the faintest skin cell one shed during a single touch. Luis worked slowly, passing the nozzle along the inner lining, the rubber lip, the heel. The particles gathered in a small collector, a dusting so thin it looked like nothing at all. The duct tape samples required a different process. The adhesive, degraded over time, still held potential. The technicians trimmed the edges, exposing regions most likely to retain cellular material. Under magnification, they searched for traces embedded in the residue shards too small for the human eye, but not too small for modern sequencing. Hours turned into days. The evidence rotated between machines, PCR amplifiers, genetic sequencers, YSTR analyzers. Computer models pieced together fragmented signals, testing thousands of permutations before settling on a stable profile. The process was slow, methodical, and somehow reverent, as if the scientists were speaking to the evidence in a language only time and precision understood. On the fourth morning, a profile began to emerge. Dr. Marston leaned close to the monitor, her brow tightening as she read the markers. The data grew clearer with each pass, taking on the unmistakable shape of a full YSTR pattern. Strong, distinct, male, and not Daniel Ellison. The lab ran the sample again, then again. Every run yielded the same profile. When they uploaded it to the state offender database, the match appeared within seconds. Caleb Riker, 41, a transient construction laborer with a record of violent offenses stretching across multiple counties. In 2005, he had been contracted for a state bridge project less than a mile from where Mara's boots were found. Louise turned to Dr. Marston. The room seemed to still around them. "It's him," he said quietly. "And the father?" she asked. Completely excluded. The breakthrough didn't feel like triumph. It felt like breath released after years of holding it in, a slow unwinding of tension that had lived in the evidence for too long. Marston opened the duct tape file next. The secondary analysis confirmed the same male profile on the adhesive partial, but unmistakably linked. A microscopic skin cell had outlasted water, mud, and time. The truth had been hiding there from the beginning, inches away from discovery, waiting for technology to catch up. When the lab prepared its official report, the language was careful, strict, impossible to misinterpret. It stated conclusively that the DNA belonged to Riker and excluded Daniel. It referenced the reliability of the new process, the redundancy of the tests, and the statistical certainty of the match. Eli received the call on a pale morning, sitting in his patrol car at the edge of the grain elevator lot. His hands tightened around the steering wheel as he listened. The words were clinical but devastating in their simplicity. Strong match, profile confirmed, father excluded, suspect identified. He closed his eyes, letting the weight of the moment settle. The truth didn't rewrite the past, it exposed it. It revealed the fractures everyone had chosen not to look at, the assumptions that had buried the real story. He drove straight to the sheriff's office. Buckley listened in silence as Eli recited the findings. When he finished, the sheriff sat back in his chair and stared at the calendar pinned crookedly to the wall. "We did this," Buckley whispered. "We let the town do this." Eli didn't answer. The silence between them held too many things: regret, disbelief, a fragile sense of responsibility. They notified the county attorney. They coordinated with the state. An arrest warrant was issued for Riker within hours. He was picked up at a halfway house across the state line, confused at first, then resigned when confronted with the science. As the news spread, Willow Bend reacted in ways no one could predict. The diner fell silent. Church pews filled with uneasy murmurs. The co-op aisles filled with people who suddenly remembered things they had once ignored. Whispers turned inward again, but this time with guilt instead of certainty. Eli drove to Lena's house later that afternoon. She opened the door slowly, her eyes tired, her posture cautious. When Eli told her, she didn't speak at first. She sat on the edge of the couch, hands trembling, as if her body wasn't sure whether to collapse or stand, so he didn't. She finally said, the words barely audible. "No," Eli replied gently. "He didn't." She pressed her hand to her mouth. A single sound escaped, a sob or maybe a breath. Then she disappeared into the bedroom and returned with the box she always kept near the dresser. Inside it, the remaining yellow boot lay wrapped in tissue, preserved as carefully as a memory could be. She held it as if it were alive, as if the weight of it could anchor her to the truth she had waited years to hear. A few miles away, Daniel sat in a visitation room, listening to the attorney explain the findings. He stared down at the table, silent. His shoulders shook once, barely perceptible. When he lifted his head, his eyes carried something unfamiliar, something between disbelief and the faintest spark of hope. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," the attorney said, "you get your life back." The creek where it all began remained unchanged, still moving, still quiet, still holding the memory of those boots in its reeds. But the story had shifted. The silence was broken. Science had reached back through 7 years and found a truth no one had been willing or able to see. Hit the like button if you believe justice always finds its way. The arrest of Caleb Riker happened on a gray morning that carried the faint smell of rain, the kind of air that makes old buildings creak as if remembering things they shouldn't. At a halfway house 2 towns over, Riker was eating a bowl of cereal when officers arrived. He looked up, confused but calm, as if the day had simply taken an unexpected turn. When he was handcuffed, he asked only one question: "What's this about?" The lead officer answered with the same steady restraint practiced by those who had delivered bad news many times. "It's about something you did a long time ago." And the science finally caught up. Riker didn't resist. He didn't argue. He didn't deny anything. He was silent during the drive, staring at the passing fields with the detached stillness of someone who understood, on some distant level, that the world had been preparing for this moment long before he had. In the back of the car, the hum of the engine seemed louder than usual, as if it was carrying the weight of 7 lost years. News of the arrest spread through Willow Bend with the same quiet force that once carried suspicion toward Daniel Ellison. People lingered at the diner windows, watching the patrol cars speed down the highway. At the co-op, conversations faltered in mid-sentence when someone's phone buzzed with a text about the suspect's name. Faces flushed, glances shifted. The weight of guilt shared, unspoken, heavy settled like a low cloud over the town. Daniel was transported from the correctional facility to the county courthouse 2 days later. The guards who escorted him carried neutral expressions, but their eyes softened briefly, as if they sensed something shifting beneath the routines of their day. He walked with quiet steps, uncertain of what waited beyond the thick glass doors. When he saw Ely standing inside the courthouse entrance, holding a folder pressed to his chest, Daniel paused. Something in his face flickered a mix of hope and disbelief. "They're reopening your case," Ely said quietly. "The DNA." "It wasn't you, Daniel. It never was." Daniel swallowed hard, his voice barely audible. "They believe that now?" "It's not about belief anymore," Ely replied. "It's proof." Inside the courthouse, everything took on the solemnity of a long-delayed reckoning. The fluorescent lights hummed, the floors shined from countless shoes passing through, and the courtroom felt colder than usual, as if trying to distance itself from the years of wrong conclusions it once housed. Benches filled quickly with reporters, residents and officials, their expressions tight with curiosity and shame. Riker was escorted to the defense table. His posture sagged slightly, as though he had already accepted that the trial was merely a formality. Across the room, Lena sat beside the victim advocate, clutching a folded handkerchief between her palms. The yellow boot wrapped in its protective case rested on the evidence card a few feet away, small and impossibly quiet. The opening arguments were stark, grounded in the irrefutable language of science. The prosecutor stood with steady conviction, describing how the boots, preserved for years, held microscopic truth waiting to be revealed. She spoke of the new technologies that could isolate trace cells, generate profiles, and build connections across time. She spoke of how progress had finally delivered clarity. The defense tried to question the chain of custody, the degradation of evidence, the reliability of advanced methods. But each attempt dissolved under the weight of triple redundant tests, consistent profile matches, and the absence of Daniel's DNA. The courtroom felt suspended between two realities: the past, where certainty had been constructed from fear, and the present, where science had dismantled that certainty one sequence at a time. When Dr. Marston took the stand, her calm authority filled the room. She explained each lab process with clarity: microvacuuming, PCR amplification, YSTR analysis. She described how a single trace cell lodged inside the boot lining led directly to Riker, how the duct tape adhesive held matching biological material, how the probability of error was negligible. Lena watched her with unwavering focus, her breath catching at words she barely understood but felt deeply. For her, the science was not about molecules or markers. It was about a truth she had carried silently, stubbornly, for 7 long years. Then came the moment the courtroom seemed to hold its breath for. The prosecutor asked Riker directly if he had anything to say about the DNA evidence. He glanced at the jury, then at the floor. "I was working near that creek," he muttered. "There were kids around sometimes." The prosecutor let the silence stretch before replying. "That child was 4 years old." Riker said nothing else. He hunched inward, his shoulders drawing close, as though trying to shrink away from everything the room represented. Daniel took the stand next, though his testimony was brief. He spoke softly, steady but almost detached, as if recounting events from another life. He described the morning Mara disappeared, his futile search, the endless interviews where grief was interpreted as guilt. He didn't ask for sympathy. He didn't accuse anyone. He simply stated the facts of a life upended. The courtroom listened without shifting. Even the air felt still, pressing against the walls like an invisible witness. When the jury returned, the verdict was read with the steady monotone of judicial ritual. Guilty, guilty on all counts, guilty beyond doubt. Riker's expression did not change. He looked straight ahead, unblinking, as though he had always known this moment would arrive, even if he didn't know when. Lena closed her eyes. A single tear slipped down her cheek, not from relief alone, but from the sheer weight of all the years that had passed without truth. The handkerchief crumpled in her hands, damp and twisted. Daniel sat motionless for a few seconds. Then he lowered his head into his hands, his shoulders trembling, not with loud sobs, but with the quiet collapse of someone finally freed from a burden too heavy to carry. Eli watched him from the back row, feeling something unclench inside his chest, something he hadn't realized he'd been holding since the first hours of the investigation years earlier. Later, as people filed out of the courtroom, their conversations low and uneasy, the sheriff approached Daniel and offered a simple apology. Not an explanation, not a justification. Just an apology spoken with the gravity of a man who understood too well how silence and assumption had shaped their failure. Outside, the afternoon light washed gently across the courthouse steps. Reporters spoke into cameras with muted voices. Residents lingered in small clusters, trying to reconcile the new truth with the old one they had embraced so easily. Some looked ashamed, others simply looked lost. Lena and Daniel walked side by side toward the parking lot, leaving a building that had once condemned him. For a long time, they said nothing. Then Lena reached into her bag, pulled out the small case, and handed it to him. He opened it slowly. The single yellow boot rested inside, its buckle slightly tarnished, its rubber faded but intact. "She kept it," Lena whispered. "All these years." Daniel touched the boot gently, the way someone touches a fragile relic. He closed the case and held it against his chest. Across the lot, Eli stood beside his cruiser, watching them leave. He felt a strange, quiet humility settle over him, a recognition that truth, once lost, is never recovered easily. It requires time, science, courage, and sometimes the painful acknowledgement of collective failure. As the Ellisons drove away, the wind carried the faint rustle of leaves across the pavement. It sounded like something letting go, something shifting toward a future no longer shadowed by doubt. Justice had not come quickly, it had not come cleanly, but it had come. In the weeks after the verdict, Willow Bend moved more quietly than usual, as though the town itself was adjusting to a truth it had spent years refusing to see. Conversations softened. People walked a little slower through the aisles of the co-op, unsure whether to greet Lena with apology or with silence. Most chose neither. They simply stepped aside, offering a gentle nod, as if acknowledging something tender and fragile they had once mishandled. For Lena and Daniel, the days that followed felt uncertain but strangely lighter. They returned to the small house on Maple Lane, where every room still carried pieces of the life they once shared. Dust had settled thickly on the dresser in Mara's room. A stuffed rabbit waited on the pillow, untouched since the night everything changed. Standing in that doorway again, they didn't speak. They simply allowed the quiet to fill the space, letting their grief exist without fear or judgment. Daniel moved slowly through the house, rediscovering it in quiet breaths. He noticed the way the afternoon sun still warmed the corner of the living room where Mara used to stack her blocks. He touched the dent in the kitchen wall where her toy wagon once bumped too hard. He opened the box that held her remaining yellow boot and held it with steady hands. It no longer felt like an accusation. It felt like a part of her returning home. In town, people wondered how the Ellisons would rebuild. Some hoped they would leave Willow Bend, start fresh someplace where the past held less power, but Lena stayed. And so did Daniel. Not because the town deserved their forgiveness, but because their memories were rooted here, in the cottonwoods, in the small yard, in the long stretch of sky over Blackthorn Creek. Leaving would have felt like abandoning the pieces of their daughter that still lived in those places. Eli visited them one evening after his shift, carrying a simple wooden frame. Inside it was the lab's formal statement of exoneration, printed with the clarity and finality of science. He didn't stay long, but before he left, he offered something that had taken him years to understand. "I can't undo what we failed to see," he said quietly. "But I want you to know that we see you clearly now." Daniel nodded. He didn't need a longer apology. Truth had already spoken on his behalf. With time, the Ellisons learned to move gently through their changed world. They fixed the loose gutter on the porch. They planted sunflowers along the fence line, something Mara had once asked for. On quiet mornings, Lena sat on the back steps and watched the light spill through the cottonwoods the way it used to. The ache never disappeared, but it softened around the edges, becoming something they could carry without breaking. Each year, on Mara's birthday, they walked together to the creek. They stood where the reeds bent toward the water and placed a pair of new yellow rain boots along the bank. Not to replace what was lost, but to honor what remained, the memory of a child whose small footprints had reshaped their entire lives, and the truth that had taken 7 long years to surface. Justice had come slowly, unevenly, painfully, but it had come. Not through the assumptions of neighbors or the hurried certainty of early investigators, but through the quiet persistence of science and the willingness of one man to reopen a file no one else wanted to touch. It was a reminder that time can bury the truth, but it can also uncover it, piece by piece, if someone is patient enough to look again. And even in a town marked by betrayal, hope found its way back, soft, steady, familiar as the sound of the creek moving over stone. Which case should we tell next? Leave your suggestion below.